Right then, hello everyone, and welcome back to Dutiful Future. That's right, it's time for another episode. You can put down your essays, quit off the Deliveroo app, and put down the cheat sheet that you use for your weekly family quizzes. And it's time to listen for another great episode here. I have with me the fantastic senior political reporter for Business Insider, Adam Payne. Adam, hello.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me. I hope you and all your many listeners are well and holding up okay in these very obviously bizarre and not particularly pleasant times. But thank you very much for having me on. I'm very flattered.
Thanks for coming on, Adam. I hope everything's well with you as well, of course. So today's episode is going to be, the theme of it essentially, or the title is going to be COVID and Brexit, covering the crises. So what I've got for Adam is a lot of questions about the differences between covering, these two major events that we've had, Brexit and then now COVID back to back. But then as well as just general questions about, your life as a political reporter and journalist and your progression as well. So the first question I think I have is pretty simple. What is the life of a daily politics reporter, both pre-lockdown and now that things have kind of gone on their head?
Goodness. What a good question to start with. Very clearly some massive practical differences. So firstly, up until 7 weeks ago, I was in Parliament 4 days a week. So my day would be, I'd get up quite early in the morning. I would write some news in my house in London, in North London, and then I would make my way to Parliament. And then when you're in Parliament, you have quite a clear routine of, you have the lobby briefing at lunchtime. And for those of you who don't know, I imagine it might be quite a lot actually. That's when you question the Prime Minister's spokesperson, and then you do that. And then in the afternoon, you might go and have coffees with MPs and various people. So it was you're up and about a lot. You're doing you're not at your desk a lot, or at least I wasn't. I was doing lots of going around Parliament, meeting various people, working on stories, etc. Now, obviously, the big practical difference is that I'm in my bedroom in London every day. I'm doing a lot of the similar things, so I'm still tuning into the lobby briefing, only it's over the phone with all the other political journalists, and I'm still speaking to MPs and whoever else, but on Skype like this, or on Zoom, or one of the other forums which have kind of exploded into life in these last few weeks.
You've exposed us for using Skype. I'm sorry, everyone. I know it's outdated.
Yeah, exactly. No. It's good. It's a classic. It's good to see you staying to the original. And I guess as well, obviously I don't see my colleagues. So what I really like to do at the beginning of the week, me and my two colleagues on the Business Insider Politics desk will have an editorial meeting where we'll sit in Parliament in Portcullis House, which is where the cafes are for any of your listeners who have been to Parliament, or perhaps you have as yourself. And we'll throw some ideas around. We'll discuss what we're going to do this week. And when you're in Parliament, obviously you'll pass MPs and you'll pass people, and that might be how you strike up a conversation which leads you to a story or something you want to pursue. Obviously, that element of the job has been shelved for the foreseeable future. So I guess the differences are practical in terms of what I'm actually doing as a journalist. And I guess going into, and this is true of every journalist, but going into this crisis, this national crisis, I was hoping to continue my reporting on Brexit, because that's what I've been doing, not exclusively, but largely I've been writing about Brexit for the last 18 months or so. And I was planning on continuing that reporting into future trade relationships and preparing for the end of a transition period. But that obviously has been not completely put to one side, but it is no longer the priority. We've had to adapt to this completely new subject and get to grips with it. I've never reported on health or science before, so it's a lot to get used to. So they are two. That's probably quite a convoluted way of saying it's two very different worlds. But isn't it for everyone? I mean, the vast majority of people have been thrust into something they're not used to, something completely different. I do miss Parliament. I miss obviously being around people, kind of the atmosphere of Parliament. Hopefully we'll be back there soon, but I mean, realistically, it probably won't be for a long time.
So you brought it up there. A lot of your job, a lot of your stories rely on, I guess, meeting and then chatting to and happening upon politicians, MPs, or people around them. Is now this social distancing making it far more difficult to have these sort of insider relations that are required for having a finger on the pulse, I guess, in politics? And if so, how are you and yourself and your team adapting to this?
That's a good question. I think that there is, as I said, there's an element of my job is you'll be sat in Parliament and you might just pass someone who you were meaning to speak to, or someone might recognize you or you might recognize them, and you approach them and you have that conversation. That might lead to a coffee or a phone call later in the week, and that could be kind of the seed which grows into a story eventually. Obviously, that's gone now. I mean, it doesn't. I'm still making lots of phone calls. I can still ring press offices. If I want to get in touch with someone, I can find out their phone number quite quickly. But I guess what I'm having to do now more of is rely on the pool of sources I already had. So let's take the Conservative Party, for example. I've got a number of Conservative MPs who I speak to. I have their phone numbers, their email addresses, perhaps the contact details of their staff, and I can get in touch with them quite easily because I've established a relationship over time. Whereas now, if I wanted to establish a relationship with someone else, that's harder because I can't go for a coffee. I can't have that same. It's harder to establish that relationship because, as you know, Hugh, it's easier to establish rapport with someone in person rather than trying to do it over the phone. So I guess it is harder to establish new relationships with people, particularly MPs. But at the same time, as I said, still having phone calls, still doing my best to. But it's difficult, Obviously, journalism is a very multifaceted profession. It's about writing, it's about research, but a big part of it is just meeting people and having a particular set of social skills a lot of the time. And when that's kind of taken out of the picture, when that's taken off the table, as it were, you do have to adapt to that. It's a significant change to the way you do things. And to be honest, I still think I'm adapting to that, and I'm trying to make it work.
Mm-hmm. So another thing you've had to adapt to, as you said, you've been a Brexit writer for the last 18 months, and obviously, once COVID started becoming a problem around this way, the issue of Brexit doesn't just stop. However, obviously the focus now is entirely on COVID. Have you felt much pressure in terms of not being able to cover these sort of things, or is there very much a stop-start button on the sort of on the Brexit coverage straight over to the COVID one? Was it a very quick transition, or is this something where you're still keeping your eye on what potentially could be developing, which we can't necessarily see?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when it became clear how serious coronavirus was going to be, and when it became clear to journalists, to us, that this is going to be a massive story, and it's going to be the massive story for a long time, I think that was quite instant. It was like, right, let's channel all of our focus, all of our curiosity, quite literally all of our resources into writing about coronavirus. And that, for me, what does that mean for me? Well, obviously, I'd established a lot of contacts in the world of Brexit, so trade and finance, like MPs, blah, 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 blah. But also, I'd established just a knowledge of the subject. So from writing about something more and more, when something becomes your beat, you just become I wouldn't describe myself as an expert, but there are certain things I feel comfortable talking about, like supply chains or the single market, things like that. So when you've got to suddenly, instantly kind of flick that switch off, I found that quite difficult to do because, practically speaking, I had to change what I was doing every morning. So I wouldn't be reading the same newsletters or reading the same publications or looking at the same sort of Twitter feeds. I'd be completely changing my consumption, what I'm actually reading. Now, I guess for us, because we are a 3-person desk, quite a small politics desk, I guess, relatively speaking. We were just completely focused on coronavirus. I guess for the first 3 weeks, where not just the United Kingdom, but countries across Europe and elsewhere were just shutting down their economy, shutting down their borders. I guess in the last few weeks, the news cycle has slowed down somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
And that's given me a chance to kind of dip my feet back into the world of Brexit. And for anyone, who, if you were to like read what I've written in the last few weeks, you'll be able to notice that some Brexit stories have just started to pop up.
Started to sift them back in.
Exactly, yeah. So I've been able in the last few weeks to kind of see what's going on in that world, catch up with people, see what's happening, because it adds, just in reality, although coronavirus is clearly a massive story, the biggest threat to this country, well, since World War II, we'd probably say, Brexit and the trade negotiations are still happening somehow, or in the background. So I think now I've actually reached quite a place where I'm quite happy with, whereby when I wake up in the morning, the first thing on my mind is coronavirus. But then when we get into the afternoon, and I'm looking at kind of original reporting, some interviews, other things I can do, then I'm able to focus on Brexit or perhaps party politics. And at the moment, I've got quite a nice balance, whereas a few weeks ago, it was just 100% relentless COVID, obviously. And that was quite a jarring shift, I think, because I just had to basically take everything I was going to work on, throw it out the proverbial window. But now I have reached, as I said, over this 7 weeks, I have reached a place where I feel like I can focus on the things I want to focus on, and also do what's necessary, right about what's important when it comes to the coronavirus.
So you brought it up there to a certain extent. The differences in covering, going from all about Brexit to all about coronavirus. What would you say has been the biggest difference so far? Some of the practical aspects. What was your biggest shock in terms of transitioning from one major issue to the next? But then also, were there any changes in spirit, in sort of the attitude towards covering the two situations in comparison to each other?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that with Brexit, although, let's handle the similarities first. That's just how my mind works. So
go for it.
The similarities, both subjects are technical. They require you not just to have a knowledge of party politics. It actually, so Brexit required me to really swat up on things like trade and how supply chains work and where we get our food and our medicine, and how the channel crossing works. And that took time I wasn't able to write about that sort of thing until I did at least some degree of research into it. COVID, I think, is similar in that you have to very quickly, perhaps much more quickly than I had to with Brexit. I had to really quickly get swatted up on things like what these scientific bodies are and what we actually mean by pandemic, and how just the science behind it. So those things are similar. In terms of how different it's been, I guess with Brexit, that was, even though Brexit negotiations were happening in Brussels and London, and we're talking about negotiations and policy decisions which are going to have massive impact for our economy and just our global standing, that was still very parliamentary based. It was all about parliamentary votes. Does Theresa May have the numbers to do X, Y, and Z? It was about amendments. Christ, do you remember the heady days of like the Grieve Amendment and all that sort of
stuff? The good old days.
The heady days of the Grieve.
We didn't know how lucky we were.
Exactly. And the Letwin Amendment as well. So I guess with Brexit, that was very parliament based, and I don't think I would be able to have covered it in the same way at home like I am now, because so much of it is just happening in Parliament. But with COVID, with the coronavirus, very little of it I mean, obviously, this is a practical consequence of the fact that Parliament's not operating as it usually does. But I think the coronavirus as an issue isn't really one that's focused in Parliament at the moment. Obviously, MPs are holding the government to account, so you'll follow committee sessions and what's happening in the House of Commons. But a lot of the stuff which is happening with coronavirus is happening in hospitals or in care homes, or in the last few weeks I've written stories about funeral homes. I've written stories about small companies who are trying to produce face masks for the government. Apologies. So it's been less focused in Parliament, I think. So that, although it's a political issue, it's not as political in the sense that it's focused, centred in Parliament. And I think a second thing I'd say is that with Brexit, it was very tribal in the sense that it was very much it very much overlapped with party politics, and not just party politics, but you'd have a group of MPs. You know, it was very almost
factional.
Yeah, factional is the word I'm looking for. Yeah, and that was a big part of it. Like, what's this group of MPs up to right now? What's Hannah Soubry doing? Or alternatively, what's the ERG doing? Or what are the pro People's Vote Labour MPs doing? Blah 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 blah. But with coronavirus, there's an element of party politics in that Keir Starmer now is saying that the government has been too slow, blah blah blah. But really, it's not party political in any other way. So obviously the government is under pressure for how it's handled things, but it's not party political in the same way that other issues are. So you're not thinking to yourself, oh, I wonder what Ian Duncan Smith thinks of this. Or I wonder what this influential MP or what this cluster of SNP MP, like, you don't view it through the same lens. So I think that is a difference. And thirdly, and in my mind just now, I said, should I say this? But I think that coronavirus is just really depressing. Like, I think one thing it doesn't get, like, Brexit at times can be quite frustrating, and there were nights where you'd be in Parliament until the early hours, and it felt like nothing was being done, and that the country was divided, and that our political system's bloody hopeless, and it was kind of really deflating. But then the next day, you'd get up quite excited, like, right, you know, I've got this interview today, I've got this story I'm really excited about, or we've got this, I don't know, this House of Commons vote, which is going to be on a knife edge. But with coronavirus, as a journalist, it is very challenging because it is just a grim subject where you're writing about people dying, and outside of your room or wherever you happen to be working, you'll probably know people who've been affected by it. So I think I've only been doing this job for, I don't know, God, it feels like a lifetime, 4 years. And but I've never known a subject where you have to really manage your emotions and really check your own kind of mental well-being and things like that. So that's a big difference. Although Brexit was exciting and infuriating, and depending on what side of the fence you were, sometimes you'd be ecstatic, other times you'd be miserable. But with coronavirus, is different. It's much more emotionally challenging, I think.
I think when looking at the two issues like side by side, and how your experiences in covering both of them, as you said, now you have a lot more concerns about like mental well-being and those sort of issues. I think it's almost like looking at them both and thinking, British politics, these issues went from a tragic comedy to just a tragedy. And that has really changed how it can be covered. And obviously, these divisions in Parliament that you saw in Brexit, which are obviously less of a thing now, I mean, translates into the public as well, where Brexit was such a divisive issue, but now, especially, well, not especially, during COVID, there are extreme calls for this, unity and getting behind the government and these sort of things. Do you ever feel this sort of pressure to be more positive and to be more, rallying together? You see some people criticizing journalists saying like, "Oh, you shouldn't be reporting on these very depressing things. We need to rally together and unify." Is this a pressure you ever feel from the public or anyone around you?
You know what, Hugh? I've actually seen a Facebook status. I think it's gone viral a few times. I think it's been screen grabbed and put on Twitter, and it says something along the lines of what you were just kind of paraphrasing, that journalists need to kind of read the mood of the public and be more optimistic and kind of get behind the government. And while I can understand where that comes from, I personally think it's complete nonsense, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, and I get this is a philosophical point.
Mhm.
When you think about the nature of the decisions the government is making right now, decisions which are literally, it's not flippant or kind of glib to say that it's life or death decisions they're making at the moment. Just the idea philosophically that those decision makers shouldn't be held to account in an incredibly thorough, but also in good faith, in a fair way, but in a thorough, probing, and at times aggressive way, if it's warranted. The idea that the government shouldn't be held accountable in that way, I just find mind-boggling. I couldn't think of a time where an empowered, kind of dogged press is more appropriate, really. And secondly, I actually think Lewis made this point when he was on your Lewis Goodall, who's now at the BBC, formerly of Sky. I think and a lovely guy and fantastic journalist. He made this point when he was on your podcast. So I'll try not to completely plagiarize him, but
Go for it.
Because often some of the abuse I see directed at journalists on Twitter, or I mean, sometimes at me. I mean, I don't get any near as much as abuse as some journalists do, but particularly women. A lot of the time, their criticism will be, "Well, I don't like that question," or "I don't think your question's fair," or "You're repeating yourself. We've heard that before." And I guess there's a difference, and this is where I will sound very similar to Lewis. There is a difference between the public interest and what the public is interested in. For example, I'm sure, and I can understand why some people might be really bored of hearing about PPE. It's all they hear every bloody day: PPE, and journalists banging on about it. But there's a difference between being interested in something, finding something engaging, kind of, I don't know, fascinating, and then that subject, pursuing it because it's for a public good. Because if we don't hold the government to account enough on PPE, and PPE failings end up contributing to unnecessary loss of life, then that is a failing of scrutiny, I think. So there is a difference between, another example, before I finish this particular point, this new mobile phone app, this mobile phone app for tracking and tracing the coronavirus, which has been launched on the Isle of Wight. Now, to some people, that might be really kind of distant, sort of jargonistic, techie, just not interesting. And that's fair enough. Like, to be honest, before writing about this, I probably wouldn't have been interested in a mobile app being, rolled out on the Isle of Wight. But if this app is successful, it could be a massive step towards easing the lockdown in a pretty significant way. Or if it's not successful, then what does that mean? Does that mean that our country's kind of project of getting out of the lockdown is delayed by another month? And obviously that would have huge ramifications for the economy, blah, blah, blah. So that's clearly in the public interest to pursue that. And thirdly, what I found quite funny or ironic is, before the government introduced these questions from the public, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, a lot of journalists were getting stick saying, "Stop asking when the lockdown's ending because it's a stupid question." And now half the questions from the public have been asking when the lockdown's ending. So actually, I don't think the difference between what the public wants to know and what journalists want to know is actually that massive. I mean, is every question asked in these press conferences a brilliant question? Obviously not. I think journalists, because we all work together, we all talk together on WhatsApp, we're definitely guilty of groupthink. And there are definitely occasions where some journalists might be focused more on their front page tomorrow morning rather than the pursuit of a particular issue. And not every question is a paragon of like forensic, concise questioning. But generally, I think journalists have done a decent job, and If you want good news, if all you want is positive news, then subscribe to the government press releases. So that's my very.
I couldn't agree more.
That's my monologue in response
fantastic
to
answer.
that question. I want none of my future responses will be as long as that. I promise.
Please, I would never complain. People aren't here to listen to me, Adam.
I had to take a drink because of that.
From the Adam mug, by the way. Everyone, you can show off the Adam mug.
See that? Yeah, it's got my name on it.
The Adam mug. Shout outs to the Adam mug. So once again, you brought it up there very well. Where it is one of the differences between covering Brexit and covering COVID, this sense of, I guess, immediacy. So Brexit was it always felt like a deadline along the road. It felt like something which is like we're approaching a deadline, and then it keeps getting extended, or when's it going to happen, rather than a consistent, persistent, and daily evolving issue like COVID is. Is this sort of, is there more of a passive versus I guess consistent and reactive coverage across these two issues, or are they far more similar in terms of dealing with the daily changes and updates?
I guess I think there is, in terms of immediacy, they both had immediacy in the sense that, in a quite simple sense of the word, that every day you just have ridiculously busy days where there was just news. So practically speaking, on a busy day in the world of Brexit, you might be writing like bam, like, I don't know, half a dozen or more articles a day, and they're by their nature immediate. And the same with the coronavirus. When the government announced it, well, like on Sunday evening when the Prime Minister did his televised statement, that was a very immediate story because it was a number of announcements made within quite a short space of time. But I think a more kind of perhaps nuanced point is that with Brexit, as you said, that was played out on, I guess, on a more clear time frame. So, for example, you'd know that Brexit Day was March 31st. So then if Article 50 gets extended, it gets pushed back to whenever it was, October the 31st. And the way the story played out with Brexit was obviously working towards a specific date. And that's kind of how the story developed. But with the coronavirus, it's so... We're unsure over everything. So we don't know when... Obviously, the government scientists had an idea of when the peak was going to be, but we didn't have a fixed date. And I think they were about 2 weeks out in the end. We don't have a clue when there's going to be a vaccine. There might not be one. I hope to God there is one. But we don't know when there's going to be one. It could be 6 months. It could be 2 years. We don't know when you'll be able to go for a pint again. So it's just a very different terrain. It's a very different terrain to try and navigate. With Brexit, although so much of it was unprecedented and chaotic, there was still lots of concrete things you could grab onto, like, right, this vote is this day, Brexit Day is October, the EU Council Summit is on this day. But with coronavirus, you really don't know when you wake up in the morning what the news is going to be, because we don't really understand the virus, right? So I guess with the coronavirus, there is a less sense of immediacy because you don't know where this is going. I think it's difficult to have a perception or to perceive immediacy when you don't have a clue where this is going or where it's going to end or how long it's going to be. But with Brexit, you had very clear deadlines and cliff edges. That term became really popular in Brexit reporting. So you did have a sense of immediacy.
How is this immediacy impacted yourself and your daily coverage? In that, is there almost a sense of, I guess, reassurance in having like a fixed date or having this sort of cliff edge? Did it make it more stressful in its daily coverings? Did you feel more of a need to investigate even further and further because there was a deadline to where this would be over? Or is the issue of COVID far more stressful to deal with because it is, seeming there isn't a very clear definitive end in sight?
I think that I mean, as I said before, generally COVID is just a more stressful, emotionally taxing issue to cover by definition. I think that's quite an interesting question, because I think obviously on the Sunday, when the Prime Minister gave us a vague timetable of when we might be able to do things. So it was like in June we might be able to open non-essential shops. We can have the Premier League back in July, maybe some restaurants, and then in the autumn maybe some pubs. And even though that's quite a vague, sort of nebulous timetable, I guess from my point of view, as I said in my previous answer, it's just kind of things to hang on to. You can visualize the next few months and what you're going to be reporting about and what you're going to be looking at. So I just think from a purely journalistic point of view, that is less stressful, because the problem was, Hugh, that a few weeks ago, like, we didn't have a clue where this was going. There was no sense of roadmap. So often you didn't really know what you should be covering at certain times, and then, or when's this issue going to become not interesting? How long is this issue shelf life? And so I think it's easier to make decisions about just your editorial strategy when you have got a clearer sense of what's coming. But for example, a few weeks ago I wrote a story about PPE and how there was a guy in Merseyside in Liverpool, and he offered the government, I think it was 10 million face masks that he'd sourced from Germany. It ended up being quite a big story. A few other places covered it, The Guardian, Channel 4 and stuff. But then I was thinking to myself, well, how long is PPE going to be an issue? Like, are we going to be suffering PPE shortages for 2 years? Like, how many more of these stories am I going to do? And at what point, how many of these stories do I write to the point where it stops being interesting, to be honest? Like, how many stories about PPE companies not having their PPE offers being accepted? How many times can I write that to the point where it stops becoming interesting or even instructive? So yeah, I think when we do have these milestones to aim for, things the government's aiming for, it's a lot easier, I think, or less stressful, to come back to the original wording of your question. It's a lot less stressful, I think, journalistically.
So, I think one thing I've noticed in a lot of your writing and your coverage, issues like COVID and Brexit, they seem so large and expansive and all-encompassing that it can be difficult to, I guess, sort of ground them. And I guess my question is, something that I've potentially noticed in your work is you tend to have quite a localizing, consistent sense of localizing issues. So, for example, you had an article about 3/4 of UK truckers to go out of business from 2 months of COVID, or one about the closing of call centers and construction sites. Is this something that you try and consciously do when covering crises such as these? Is to localize them and make them quite grounded in your coverage, and if so, why?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for reading my work. That's genuinely really lovely to hear. So
I encourage everyone else to as well. Please
and
do.
Secondly,
Adam Payne 26 on Twitter.
That's correct. Secondly, I do. Yeah, that is deliberate. Actually, I'm just really glad you've. It's really nice to hear someone. So basically, Hugh, and this all dates back to when I first really got my job as a full-time reporter, and I decided I wanted to do Brexit. That was my thing.
At the Tab Liverpool?
Well, the things I was writing about the Tab Liverpool were different than Brexit. But yeah, correct. So yeah. That's where I began my journalism career. But I guess what I realised, Hugh, was that I took a bit of a risk, I guess, in that I wasn't an expert on the European Union, or I had like a university degree level of it, a level of knowledge of it. But what I realised was that we were dealing with such massive subjects. When you talk about the single market or supply chains or kind of a border checks, like these are such just kind of massive, all-encompassing things, and it's very difficult to illustrate why it matters. So I think one of the, just going this is going to be kind of tangential for a second, but I think one of the issues the Remain campaign had back in 2016 was it was so obsessed with talking about things like GDP and growth. And when you say that to most people, understandably, they know what these things are, but they don't understand why this matters to their lives. So when I was reporting, I thought, well, there's got to be a way of writing about supply chains which is interesting and which can actually illuminate the issue. So as you said, what I've tried to do in my reporting, particularly my Brexit reporting, is really focus on quite minute examples of things, because often those examples can be microcosmic and represent a wider issue. So for example, when I was writing about Brexit, I wrote about food quite a lot. I wrote about how supermarkets who were stockpiling food were running out of places to put their food. And that, to me, that's much more interesting than just saying, oh, there are supply chain issues. Like, for readers, it's much easier to visualize like a factory full of food and there's nowhere else to put it. Or with the you talked about something I wrote about recently, how hauliers, truck drivers, really fearing for their livelihoods. I just think when you really focus in on a particular very small section of the economy and focus on that for a story, it's much more, well, you can get a lot more into it. When you try to deal with the whole economy in one article, it's often very broad brush and you don't really focus on anything specific. So what I've always tried to do is focus on very minute, almost like microscopically focus on little things which are interesting in their own right, but will tell you something about the wider picture. And also, often the most kind of ridiculous stories, that's where they exist. When you have conversations, like when I was writing about Brexit, and I was having conversations with people who work in the food industry or who logistics, and they deal with cross-border trade. If you just ask them for some examples of things. So if you said, oh, could you give me an example of what that actually looks like in practice? And they'll say something and you'll be like, bloody hell, that's ridiculous. That's like, I never thought that was happening. And so often those little tiny details, I think are much more interesting than kind of big general points about, bigger issues. So I'm actually really glad you said that, because that is, I think I'd probably, if someone was to ask me what kind of ties my reporting together, I think that's probably it, that I really try to focus on little things. And then hopefully those little things will be interesting in their own right. And perhaps also they can be representative of something bigger which is going on.
I think it is something that I definitely picked up on in reading your work, is that, the localized aspect of what you do. And I think I especially appreciate it because journalism and politics often gets, accusations of being quite insular or even potentially like elitist at times, and you're sort of all one big club. And I thought this was amazing at not trying to, in like a CUVC bite-sized way of like trying to dumb it down, which also some people get accused of doing, but making an issue in a very digestible, interesting, and also oftentimes more, I guess, probing and exploratory way, in that it is so much easier to conceptualize. I'm a uni student, politics student. I have to read a lot of these sort of things, constantly, and also I do because I'm a massive politics nerd. And I find yours so much easier to interesting and oftentimes more helpful, because it can give such a grounded insight into what was happening. So yeah, that great work, I guess.
Well, thank you very much. That's really kind. No, I can't really add anything to what I've just said. It's really lovely to hear you say that. So I'll try to do some more.
Please do. So on to the about the sort of, we brought up a couple of times the like constant nature of covering these crises. And you also brought up, when you're reporting about PPE, for example, you were concerned about things like, the shelf life and how long is this going to be a major issue in, public discourse. And I'm wondering, when the news is so constant, for example, in Boris Johnson's coverage, there was 15 news alerts that had that are going out even just whilst he's speaking. Is there a struggle or is this something that's always in the back of your head, which you try and balance between this being that the pure information side of things, but also things like shelf life, things like headlines, things like, oh, are people going to actually care about this as much, or is it just me? Is this something that is difficult when covering an issue which is so constant and so persistent?
Yeah, I think that is a challenge for a lot of journalists. I think that, but a lot of it. I mean, the first point, which is probably a not as exciting point, is that I'm a reporter, but I wouldn't say I'm a reporter in the same way that Beth Rigby's a reporter, or I don't know, Paul Brand at ITV. They will tweet every piece of news, usually, because they're news reporters. If you go into Beth Rigby's Twitter, the political editor of Sky, for anyone who doesn't know who she is, if you go on her Twitter feed, you'll probably see 20 tweets that day. Most of them with links to stories, because she's reporting everything that's happening, like bullet points, like bam, 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 bam. I'm not my job's not like that in the same way. I do write news, but we at Business Insider, we don't necessarily write every story. We're quite selective in terms of what we write. So, for example, just an example of that, Hugh, when Matt Hancock, the health secretary, apparently met his target of X amount of tests, 100,000 tests by the end of the month. We didn't write that because we don't really have an audience for it. There are other publications who are going to write that better than us. We don't really have anything to add to it. So I guess we're a bit like, for publications like BuzzFeed, for example, or Politico, who, like us, won't write every story. So where's this going? I personally don't feel that pressured. If I'm watching the Prime Minister in the House of Commons, for example, I'm not sat there like, right, what's the line here? I need to get a headline up. What quote?
Scribing down verbatim each word.
Sometimes it will. Sometimes the Prime Minister will say something, and I'll be like, right, that's a story. That's linked to what I've been writing about recently, and I can do that whole hustle of writing a news story. But I feel quite lucky actually that because I'm not expected to write everything, I'm not constantly there, like trying to juggle the acts of listening to what someone's saying, but then also trying to write a story. So I think I'm actually quite thankful at the moment that I'm not a reporter. The people who do this are just fantastically talented people who write everything, write all the news. In this current climate, I think you've got to have incredible work ethic to do that. And so actually, I'm not really struggling with that particular aspect of it. I think because Twitter is so widely used now among journalists that Twitter is a part of journalism. You have to talk about it as a part of journalism in the same way that newspapers are, or articles. I think one thing I'd say is that when there's a story happening, because as a journalist I kind of treat my Twitter account. That's quite a hard thing to say. I was treating my Twitter account as a public-facing source of information. Like, I'm a journalist, so often if there's a big story happening, I might feel under pressure to tweet about it, even if my tweet isn't really offering anything new, or if it's just an opinion which no one really asked for. I sometimes feel pressure to do it because you need to look like you're involved in the news. You need to look like you're on it, even if it's just something as trivial as like tweeting something an MP's texted you about the story. That's what I've been trying to grapple with. Like, I should resist tweeting just for the sake of tweeting, because often it can just lead to quite banal, vapid, forgettable things. And I've only done it because I feel under pressure to be involved in like the scrum of news, in like the chaos of it. But I actually do think I'm getting a better handle on that now. I'm weaning myself away from being on my phone all the time. But that pressure definitely still exists. That pressure to always have something to say, to always be involved in the scrum, as I said. That definitely exists. And I think a lot of journalists probably feel that way. I hope.
Is this something that you think has been becoming increasingly prevalent in journalism? Is since, a lot of the time, a lot of journalists are much more less than being about publication. They're much more of almost like a personal brand. What with them being very front facing in terms of Twitter, rather than being the name behind an article, they themselves are constantly publishing these sort of things. Is balancing, I guess, the traditions of journalism practices and integrity with the fast-paced, public-facing social media world a difficult one to sort of, I guess, balance between, obviously you brought up issues with constantly, trying to appear like you have something to say and that you're constantly involved. Are there any other issues around this sort of relationship that you found?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think when we look at Twitter and tweeting as a journalist, and I'd say I'm quite an active tweeter, generally speaking. And
Adam Payne 26.
There we are. We'll try and get it in 5 times before the end.
I can do that.
So if you're taking tweeting as a journalist, and then articles you write, which is ultimately what I'm paid for. I'm not paid to tweet. If I was, bloody hell, I'd be. Yeah,
it'd be a good life.
Yeah, I'd be owning in Islington, not renting in Islington. I think it's not mutually exclusive. It's not completely binary, because often I can tell you, for example, that most of Business Insider's traffic comes from social media. So if I happen to tweet a story I've written and that tweet goes viral and that directs traffic to my article, then that is a positive contribution to what I'm actually paid to do, which is to get people to read our website. So there's that, which can't be ignored. But there is another point in that what I find interesting, and I'm not sure if this is a good thing or a bad thing, is that there is stuff, to be honest, which as a journalist you get told, or that or that you can offer to discourse, that's probably worth a tweet, but probably isn't worth a story. And you think to yourself, I could tweet this now, and it might be an interesting tweet, or I could kind of keep it in my pocket and then maybe save it for a story next week. And what's interesting about that is that now, at least for me, I'm giving probably as much thought to Twitter and what I can tweet to what I can withhold to put in stories, or what I've been told that I can write about. So I think there is a tension there. And I mean, and another point I make as well, there are some stories I will write which I wrote tweet about, because it might be a story which has been commissioned to me, but it's not kind of my area. It's not what I'm known for. Like, I think if people follow me on Twitter, they'll associate me with Brexit reporting and particularly the techie side of Brexit. They won't associate me with some of the news stories I'm writing in the morning. So I'll deliberately not tweet them. So I guess there is a definite there are two different kind of planets almost. Like what I write for Business Insider, there's definitely a separation between that and my Twitter account. And as I said, I don't think this point I'm making has an end. It's more of a ramble around a wood without
the magic of editing can give everything an end, Adam. Don't worry.
So yeah, but I think the point you raised is a good one, because as journalists, as someone who became a journalist in 2016, I inherited Twitter. I had Twitter already, but there are other journalists who've been in the game longer than I have, who have had to kind of adopt Twitter. They didn't have to worry 20 years ago about tweeting something. They just had to file their story by, I don't know, X time, and then go home. But now Twitter has added this the greater sense of journalism never switching off. Like, Twitter doesn't sleep for anyone. I mean, newspapers have a deadline, and if you miss a deadline, then obviously you've got the website. But with Twitter, yeah, it's interesting. And I'm still, as I said, I'm trying to be on Twitter less. I'm trying to resist that pressure to be involved in Twitter. And I think I've heard Lewis Goodall talk about it before as well. It is something I do think about it a lot. I do think about how what I'm writing and what I'm tweeting kind of how it works together.
I think as we've talked about at great length at this point, you've been covering two massive, very constant, consistent, crises, Brexit and COVID. I think that sort of plays into the Twitter issue where it is, journalism never switching off, as you say. They sort of pair quite unfortunately well together. And I guess over the wealth of topics we've covered across these two issues, what would you say has been the number one thing that you've learned about covering these two historical, all-encompassing events within such a short period of time? What is the main thing you have, I guess, learned or had to adapt to from covering such massive issues?
Ooh, what have I learned? I think, I mean, this applies to all facets of life, or most. I think pacing yourself. I think when something becomes a massive story, you are tempted naturally to kind of the first week of that story just go all in and work massive shifts. Get all. I'm not against working massive shifts, by the way, but one thing I realized with Brexit was that some to be honest, Hugh, I'd get to the end of some weeks and just be absolutely knackered, and not just knackered in the sense that I was tired and will go to bed early. I'll be completely mentally just nothing left. I'd struggle to just I'd struggle to entertain a thought process, and that's because some weeks I was doing too much, and I was. I know. I mean, I do this at uni, to be honest. Like, I work quite good in the evenings for some reason, and sometimes I'd be sat there at home, and I'd be like, "Well, I might just write a bit more of this article," and then I'd sit there until 11 p.m. write an article, and I wake up in the morning just not in the right place to do a day's work. So I think just pacing yourself is what is what I've learned, or I've learned the importance of. Anyway, I don't know if I do it myself, but. But as I said, you could apply that to many areas of life. In terms of the subjects themselves, I think that with politics generally, I think this is kind of philosophical, I guess, but often it's quite trendy to say that people don't care about politics, or that people only care when there's a general election, or that people think that all parties are the same and you can't trust them, and it doesn't really matter how you vote or whatever. But people actually do care. A lot, some of the stories I've written, we discussed earlier, which were my fear was that they were too esoteric and they were too niche and no one would really care. But then when you look at which stories perform the best, often it's the ones which are really niche. Like, people do care, and people do care about politics. I just hate this this lazy kind of dismissal of people as being not interested in politics or being apolitical, just because someone doesn't sit there and watch Question Time. I mean, I don't watch Question Time; it's awful. But, just because, don't tell Lewis that, but but people are political in different ways. Like, people might not be party political; they might not have a membership card of the Labour Party, but they might be incredibly opinionated and have really strong convictions on what Britain's place in the world should be, for example. So I have learned that people are actually more interested in politics, and I even thought, and it's made me really dislike that kind of dismissal of people as not being interested in politics. I'm trying to think of something more focused on the issues. I just guess that just from I mean, if you've got anyone listening who's interested in journalism and perhaps fancies a career in it, I'd say that you'll be amazed how kind of the birthplace of stories. So some of the stories I've written about, crazy details of Brexit and how we're running out of warehouses, and one I wrote last year is about how the government realised that it'd run out of pallets to export things to you. Just these crazy stories. They can all just start with a phone call, which you've got in your diary, and you might wake up thinking, "Oh, bloody hell, I can't really be bothered with that." Like, what I'm going to get out of this person other than kind of like a background chat. So just be, I think just being curious has been with Brexit. With Brexit as a subject, being curious and digging, kind of rummaging around to see what's going on has just been really fruitful. With coronavirus, I think, as I said, this could be applied to many other areas of life, but giving yourself a break, like a few weeks ago, when Boris Johnson was admitted to intensive care, like that had quite a significant impact on my mental health. I don't know why it was that which triggered it. It really hit me hard. I was really anxious, and I think probably stepping back from it was because that particular story. It was almost like if you didn't realize how serious this was until now, the prime minister's got it. Perhaps, I don't know, but that's what triggered it for me. And I actually took the next day off work to give myself a chance just to relax and recover. So and that actually was really effective. I felt much better after doing that. Just coronavirus has taught me to be a lot more aware of my mental well-being. Just to be sensible. Don't overwork yourself. And because ultimately, when you care about politics or journalism like you and I do, you get involved. You get really emotionally involved. Like it's not like some subject at school that you don't care about and you're just trying to get like an acceptable grade. You really care about it, and you can take things to heart, and things can really bother you. So that's the other thing I've learned as well. As I've kind of got more experience in journalism, just to look after myself a bit more.
So following on from that, what would be your number one piece of advice to a budding journalist or writer, whether it be how to improve your writing or improve finding things for stories or just improve the general practice of journalism? What would be your number one, I guess piece of advice for someone trying to do this?
I'll give you two.
Go, please.
It'd be a shame when I miss one out. I think firstly, and this kind of links back to other things I've said, that journalists, particularly in Westminster, are definitely guilty of groupthink at times and pack mentality and everyone chasing the same story. When often the more interesting stories are in places you least expect to find them. So, as I said, my Brexit reporting often not about MPs or party politics. It was about what's going on in this industry or what's going on in Whitehall. So be curious, just to think outside the box. And secondly, I'd say that obviously I think political journalism is an intimidating world. You've got these big profiles: Laura Kunzberg, Robert Peston, Faisal Islam, Beth Rigby, fantastic journalists, but also really big characters. And I remember when I first got this job and I was going to press conferences and I'd be sat beside someone like this and I'd be nervous. It'd be like bumping into a musician you like or a footballer or something. But you should never. My advice is that to remember you've got just as much right to be at a press conference or in Parliament as everyone else does. You might not work for Sky and have 40 years experience, but getting into journalism is bloody hard. And if you've got that far, then you deserve as much respect as everyone else. So although it's easier said than done, because sometimes being shy or hesitant are just completely natural responses to things. But don't feel like you've got to vacate the floor and let others take over. Don't feel afraid to ask a question, because often you'll ask a really good question and the response you'll get will drive the news for that day. And if you can just grab a microphone and ask a question, people just notice you, and people are more likely to come up to you and talk to you. They might remember you next time. So that's my advice. Just, treat others obviously with respect, but treat yourself with respect as well. You deserve to be there just like everyone else does.
Fantastic. Well, Adam, thank you so much for coming on.
That's all right.
This has been fantastic. I'm going to get it in for the third time today. Everyone follow Adam on Twitter at AdamPayne26 if you've somehow missed it.
Well, do manage your expectations. Don't we're really, really hyping this up.
I couldn't possibly hype it up enough.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I hope at least half of that was coherent and made some sort of sense. But thank you very much for having me on. It's been really nice.
Thanks so much for coming on. It's been fantastic. I hope everyone's enjoyed. Thanks for watching.